from the destructive and nihilistic application of scientific knowledge into technology, from the extraction of relative and absolute surplus value, which means that the totality of living work objectified in the production of a commodity is not returned in its totality in the salary of the worker, of the proletariat who is producing the merchandise or commodity, the necessity, that is then commercialized. And because the totality of the living work is not completely returned in the salary, that surplus value derived from what Marx calls surplus work or plus work is then accumulated in the form of private property by the bourgeoisie when that commodity is sold. From the centralized control of the means of production, which leads to the alienation of the material capacity of the capitalist mode of production, in the sense that the enormous development of the forces of production, all resources, science, technology, are not used to satisfy the needs of the majorities. They are not used to abolish world poverty, but they are used only to produce and sustain industries such as the industry of programmed obsolescence, the industry of pharmaceutical production, which is interested more in selling than in curing, and in generating cycles of consumption and dependency. Alienated work, both material and intellectual. The forms of oppression, segregation, surveillance, biopower, which Foucault describes, for example, in his Histoire de la Folie, History of Madness, published in 1961. Foucault examines how the experience of madness at the end of the Moyen Age, of the Middle Ages, replaces leprosy, because leprosy at the end of the Moyen Age, at the end of the Middle Ages, begins to disappear from the Western world. And the experience of madness, which, if we take, for instance, the Birth of Tragedy of Nietzsche, is associated with the Dionysian spirit of art, mythology, of the Greek spirit, which is a type of nihilism born from strength. It is an intellectual predisposition to the most tragic aspects of the human condition, but it is a type of nihilism born from strength. That experience of madness and the mass of the donkey or the sheep of fools, which are experiences towards the end of the Middle Ages and towards the beginning of the Renaissance and the bourgeoisie modernity, drastically changes as the mode of production of the bourgeoisie, the capitalist society, develops. Because from the 17th century towards the 19th century especially, the domain of knowledge, of science, scientific discourse, becomes a cultural form. And in Foucault's philosophy, a discourse becomes a cultural form when its language is institutionalized. And when that language that belongs to a certain domain of knowledge becomes an institution, in the case, for example, of the domain of knowledge of psychology, which became the psychiatric clinic, the experience of madness changes in the bourgeoisie mode of production, in capitalism, from the experience associated with art, mythology, of the Dionysian spirit, which Nietzsche describes, from the experience of Don Quixote in Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, from the experience of King Lear in Shakespeare's tragedy, from the experience of the ship of fools of the Renaissance, to the experience of mental illness, to the experience of the mentally ill patient who needs to be confined in the psychiatric clinic. Together with the way that punishment is exercised in modernity, capitalist modernity, with Foucault's Discipline and Punish, where he shows how the forms of punishment have changed from public torture in the Middle Ages to punishment from locked doors in a prison that is governed by panopticism, to the political oppression that is exercised in the context of class struggle, all the way to the psychoanalytic repression that is intrinsic to the capitalist mode of production, which Herbert Marcuse, of the first generation of the School of Frankfurt, describes in his book Eros and Civilization. The numerous contradictions of capitalism make it urgent today, more than ever before, to change the capitalist infrastructure, to abolish the centralized control of the means of production, which leads to the alienated use of the resources of science and technology employed in order to maximize the profit of the bourgeoisie and never to satisfy the needs of the majorities. the application of science into the war industry, into the industry of programmed obsolescence, into the industry of a pharmaceutical production interested not in curing diseases and not in improving the conditions of life, but in simply generating cycles of consumption. Abolish the extraction of absolute and relative surplus value so that the totality of living work objectified in the production of a commodity is fully returned. Abolish alienated work, both material and intellectual work, so that in the realm of intellectual work, for example, scientific research is not completely subjugated to the interests of the bourgeoisie in the different markets. Abolish imperialism, which is the face of monopolistic capitalism, which implies the destruction of the third world to satisfy the economic needs of the first world, which promotes a savage imperialism. Abolish the neo-colonial exploitation in the world market in order to stop the extraction of extraordinary profit, which is called in technical terms, from the periphery, which is colonially subjugated in the world market by the first world, which continues to extract surplus value like it did in the 15th century when the Latin Germanic Europe of the Western Roman Empire opened itself to the Atlantic in 1492. To transform the domain of science, which is dehumanized, which is alienated, which leads to the experience of madness not in the artistic, not in the more humane, not in the more humorous, not in the more theatrical expressions of the Moyen Age of the Middle Ages, like Foucault says, but to the modern experience of confinement, of biopower, of the medical gaze, which Foucault describes in The Birth of the Clinic, to the modern ways of punishment within the prison and the exercise of biopower with panopticism and the repression of psychoanalytic impulses, which Herbert Marcuse describes, together with the exploitation of the third world, imperialism, wars as the best way to get out of a crisis of superabundance. All of these contradictions, and especially the destructive application of science and technology, pose a risk to the future of humanity. If the mode of production, the capitalist mode of production, is not changed within the foreseeable future, humanity will destroy itself. The accumulation of nuclear weapons, biological weapons, and chemical weapons of mass destruction alone represent an urgent threat to the survival of our species. Now, if we add the destruction of the environment, global warming, contamination, destruction of jungles, contamination of oceans, the destruction of the ozone layer, these threats are caused directly by the contradiction which historical materialism describes, the contradictions of surplus value, of centralized control of the means of production, of class struggle. Now, considering how urgent it is to change the many contradictions of the capitalist mode of production, in the sphere of public intellectuals, I want to address directly Jordan Peterson and his frankly, humiliatingly superficial and ignorant critique of historical materialism. Marx wrote his 11 theses on Feuerbach, he wrote The Sacred Family, he wrote with Engels the German ideology, he wrote the Communist Manifesto, he wrote the contribution to the critique of political economy, he wrote the Grundrisse, he wrote the manuscripts of political economy of 1844, he wrote a critique to Hegel's philosophy of right, he wrote a critique to Ludwig Feuerbach, and when he dealt in the realm of political economy, he wrote Capital. Now, Engels published posthumously the other 2 volumes of Capital. Marx was only able to produce 1 volume of Capital. But he has an extensive work that the Marx-Engels-Lenin Institute of the Soviet Union showed to what extent the production of Marx is so huge. Thousands of pages of philosophical critique to Hegel's idealism, of philosophical critique to the materialism of Feuerbach, of analysis of political economy, of critique to Adam Smith and Ricardo, to the manuscripts of surplus value, which are even mathematical in nature. Now, Marx has such a wide work that the critique which Jordan Peterson very foolishly tries to put forth is simply insulting. Jordan Peterson ignores the validity of absolute and relative surplus value. If we look at all capitalist societies, Surplus value is extracted from all proletariats who produce in both material and intellectual spheres of production, both in scientific research and in the proletariat who works in the factory. Surplus value is an empirically demonstrable fact. The centralized control of the means of production is another empirically demonstrable fact. The consequences of the centralized control of the means of production, which is the alienation and dehumanized use of science, are also empirically demonstrable. One only has to look at the thousands of nuclear weapons that are being produced, at the biological and chemical weapons of mass destruction, to see the destructive, nihilistic, apocalyptic consequences of the dehumanized use of science, which is a direct consequence of the centralized control of the means of production. Now, if we look at the proposal of anarcho-syndicalism as an alternative to capitalism, for example, when the control of the means of production ceases to be at the hands of the dominant class and is collectivized and is at the control of the proletariat, the people who produce the commodities, without a state, from the anarchist perspective, would be a much better alternative than what we have today, with political repression, both in the domain of biopower with panopticism, which Foucault described, but also in the psychoanalytic domain of a civilization that produces a type of repression that is associated specifically with alienated work, decentralized control of the means of production, and with class struggle, which Herbert Marcuse describes. So Jordan Peterson needs to read Marx. He needs to understand historical materialism first, from its roots in the critique to the philosophy of Hegel, to the critique of the materialism of Feuerbach. Then he needs to read the critique to the utopic socialism, which is presented in the critique to Proudhon's The Philosophy of Misery, and Marx wrote The Misery of Philosophy, and he criticizes Proudhon in that text. He needs to read The Sacred Family, he needs to read the German ideology, and then move on to the works of political economy, the Grundrisse, the manuscripts of 1844, Capital, Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, and then he may be equipped with a theoretical understanding and tools to speak about Marx. But until he doesn't do his homework of reading Marx carefully, he has no right to speak about something he clearly doesn't know. Just like Wittgenstein says at the end of the Tractatus, whereof one can speak, thereof one should remain silent. And Jordan Peterson needs to stop embarrassing himself with his ignorance on Marxism, which is not, I think, a question of just ignorance, but it is a question of him being what Chomsky calls a think tank. He defends the bourgeoisie system, he defends capitalism, a mode of production in which the first world has crisis of superabundance, whilst in the third world millions of people are starving. A mode of production where science is used not to solve problems like world hunger or starvation, but to produce weapons of mass destruction. A mode of production where the institutionalized language of science becomes a cultural form of oppression, of segregation, of surveillance, of biopower. And the only explanation to understand why someone like him would defend a system in which war is profitable, in which imperialism is the norm and it is called globalization, is that he's directly benefited by defending the undefendable, by defending genocide, exploitation, slavery, and all the contradictions of the capitalist mode of production. So Jordan Peterson knows nothing about Marxism.